Greetings, hot rod fans. We're about to start a very ambitious project here with the 34 Ford little hot rod truck. Okay, I am just not pleased with the front end on this car. It's a spring ahead of the big tubular axle. It looks real stubby and kind of boring in the front, but the main thing is that because the axle goes under the frame has to be very, very high off the ground. Okay, this thing is probably 8, 9, 10 inches off the ground in the front. So here's my plan. I'm going to remove everything: spring, axle, tie rods, steering arms, shocks, wheels, tires. Just strip the whole front end so that it's just the front of the frame here with the spring perch, and then install a I-beam axle that's been drilled and have it be out in front of a better spring, and set this thing down probably 4 or 5 inches closer to the ground, so that instead of sitting up real high off the ground like almost like a stock 34 Ford, it's going to have a nice rake, and the front end is going to come down, and I think it'll probably ride better because the springs you can get nowadays have Teflon discs in them, so they move real smoothly. But it's going to take a whole bunch of fabrication and engineering to do this, because nothing's going to fit after that. Okay, I'd like to use the same radius rods, but the pivot end here will have to move forward 6 or 7 inches so that they can reach the axle when it's out here in front of the spring. Steering arm here, rod will have to be elongated. The shocks, I'll have to find a place for them to mount. So it's going to be quite a chore. Okay, this is going to take probably several weeks probably to complete. So first step though is going to be the disassembly, and I'm going to start on that right now. I'll give you progress reports as different components are removed. Okay, I have the tires and wheels off so you can get a better look at what's going on here. It has early Ford drum brakes installed, and these are Ford spindles on a very, very heavy tubular axle. I think all out of proportion to the car itself. 2-inch wide spring. This is just too heavy duty really for this car. It kind of, I don't know, makes it look bulky. But like I said, the worst thing is the distance off the ground. It's probably close to 10 inches off the ground at the front, and about 4 is correct. So I'm going to have to do a lot of lowering. You can see how the big heavy tubular axle is way behind the leaf spring, and it's under the frame, which is really stupid, because it has like a 1/2 inch of travel before it hits the frame, and you can't lower the frame without hitting the axle. So it's really a bad design. I think it was done many, many years ago, back when the style probably was to have cars up high off the ground, really at about stock height, but that's not the style now. These parts are kind of neat with the holes in them. The bat wings for the hairpin radius rods, and like I said, I'm going to try to use these because these are original to the car, and I like them. I think they're really neat looking. The steering, the tie rod back here, is going to have to be re-engineered, because it's going to either have to be lowered or moved forward or something. It's going to be a real hassle, as is the mounting of the shocks. Okay, let's get back to work here on the disassembly of the front end. Well, after a couple hours of hard work, the whole front end has been removed from the car. I'll probably end up cutting those brake lines because it's just foolish to reuse old ones. I'll get new ones, and I'm going to cut these, and then I can stick a golf tee in each end to keep the brake fluid from leaking out all over everything. And here are the parts that I removed: that steering arm and the radius rods, shocks, front tires and wheels, and a bunch of the hardware right here, the dog bones and all. that hold the spring into the spring perch at the front of the frame. Okay, so we're down to the bare frame here, and now it's just waiting for the parts to arrive so that the new pieces can be fit in. Well, the parts have been arriving in big heavy boxes. The UPS guys are hating me on their way to their urologist for hernia surgery. And I've started to assemble the front end. Let me review quickly what I've done up to this point, and then we will continue. Well, let's start off here under the frame, where the first problem encountered was the original brake. Plumbing was kind of kinked and rusty up here in the front, so I removed it all and then replaced it with brand new brake lines and fittings. And then I found when the front end disc brakes arrived that they're 3/16 and the car plumbing is 1/4. So I had to get an adapter right here to allow them to connect. Then I installed the little L angle braces for the front end brake hoses, and everything looks good. I haven't tried to pressurize it yet, of course, because the banjo here is not connected to the disc brakes, but we'll see. No doubt there'll be some little leaks and all, and I have to tighten things down. But that's step one, and so far it looks a lot better, and I think it's a whole lot more secure than it was. Next, it was time to install that leaf spring, and it has these really nice Teflon buttons in between each leaf so they can slide over each other. On old leaf springs, they pretty well rust together, and the spring is like not a spring at all. It's just like a solid piece of metal. So having those Teflon discs in there will ensure that this spring will give a slightly less torturous ride. All right, the next step was to clean up those U-bolts. I bead blasted them and sprayed them with a rust-resistant kind of galvanizing paint, and put the U-bolts over. There's a T that comes out here under this shroud, and the U-bolts go over it, and then under the spring. I try to get it fairly straight. That can be worked out later, but you don't want the spring at an angle where you continually are going in a circle. That gets a little boring. So now the front spring is in, and now I'm going to put in the shackles in the eyes. Now notice this is a reversed eye spring. The little eye here is on top of the spring instead of underneath. This gives you another inch of lowering, and that's what we want with this. Because remember, it was close to 12 inches off the ground from the frame, and we want to get that way down to where the frame itself is about 8 inches, and say the lowest point on the car is about 3.5 inches off the ground. So this spring is a step in the right direction, and it's not going to stay with this much curvature. Once the weight's on it, it's going to straighten out more, so the car is going to what we call sack or settle quite a bit once the weight is put on the spring. Okay, so now the shackles, and I'm still waiting for the parts that correspond to these bat wings here. They're going to fit on that new drilled I-beam front end, but I had to order these parts, and they're coming hopefully in the next few days. Okay, one never knows. But until I get them, I can't attach the front end to the spring. So let's just make ourselves happy by installing shackles today and keep our fingers crossed for delivery of more parts tomorrow. Here we have those shackles, and they're zinc plated, just gorgeous. These are urethane bushings to go between the bolt and the inside of the eye of the spring. These things, I'm going to get a chain and just hang one of these around my neck, okay, like a necklace. But the other one, though, I'm going to install on the spring. So let's get started. And as you can see, the shackles just look dynamite against this sort of almost a wrinkled black spring. And now I'll be waiting for that bat wing to arrive, and it will fit here over this bushing, and we'll connect that I-beam front axle right up here in front of the spring. I'm putting just a little bit of molybdenum graphite lubricant here on these shackle posts, just so that the bushings can rotate smoothly and allow the front end to flex easily. Well, the bat wings finally arrived, and as you can see, they're this shiny part back here. Now, they go above and below the I-beam axle, and then this curved piece has a long kind of a bolt shaft that pushes through and holds this and this securely to the axle with a lock nut underneath. Then the radius arms connect to the wings of the bat here, and the shackles connect this curved mount to the transverse black spring. You can probably see it better from this angle. There is the circular flange of the bat wing above and below the drilled I-beam axle. Then this piece has the bolt shaft that continues all the way through, and you tighten under here with the lock nut so that the bat wing back here can pivot on the straight axle. And this piece curves up over and connects to those shackles. These are the shackles here, and connect then to the spring on the front of the car. And now with the weight of the car on it, you remember how the ends of the spring were way down here. The spring is straightened out quite a bit due to the weight of the car pressing down against it. And here are those little Teflon discs that allow the spring leaves to slip over each other so that the spring can actually flex and give you some suspension in the front. Now, the advantage of doing it this way is by moving the axle out from under the car. Remember, it was back in here and was up much higher. It had about a ½ inch of travel before it hit the frame. We moved the axle way out here in front underneath the spring, so we have all of this travel now before it hits anything. And the fact that the spring has curvature gives it even more travel in the center area. And at the ends, instead of it coming out straight here and connecting to the spindles, the ends have another 4 inches of drop bent into them, so that the whole car then, instead of being up here, has been brought way down much lower. In fact, I would say that the center here of the axle is probably only about 3 inches off the ground. One problem you encounter when you move the front axle from back here under the frame all the way out here to in front of the car itself is that now the radius rods are going to be about 5 or 6 inches too short. So let's see the procedure that I used to lengthen these and maintain their strength and good appearance. Since I had to lengthen the radius rods because the front end is now out about 4 inches further than it was, I thought instead of just tacking some metal onto the end out here to extend it, it might be a better idea, and it's a lot stronger, to cut here right above this brace, then drive in a plug into this end and pin it, and then when I slide on the extended pieces, I can weld them here very soundly and also weld a brace for that joint. Now, I had to cut some relief here in this central brace because I'm going to have to compress the heim joint ends together so that they have an eye-to-eye distance of exactly 5 inches to match the bat wings. So if I'm going to bend this inward, I had to eliminate some of the brace that would interfere. So now when I bend it down, it will match this angle that I've cut into this brace in the center. Okay, I'm ready now to tack weld the radius rods. I have squeezed the extensions down to where the distance to hold center is exactly 5 inches, the same as the bat wings. So now I'm going to tack it here, here, and probably maybe one other place, just to maintain that eye-to-eye distance, and to then check the caster with the front end, and if everything's fine, then I'll go ahead and finish welding it. Now that they've been securely tacked, I can undo the pipe clamp and install this radius rod on the car, and then double check the caster setting that it gives to the front axle. Now the radius rod is installed, and the heim joints here are connected to the bat wing, and I'm going to have to verify that I have a 7% backward tilt. That's backward from the top coming back, the bottom going forward. 7% caster setting on this front end. All right, the straight axle is in absolutely perpendicular to the line of travel. Got the radius rods adjusted properly so that we have exactly 7 degrees of positive caster in the straight axle. So now it's time to unbolt the radius rods and do the finish welding on them. There, the finish welding has been done, and I ground down the welds so that they were smooth and continuous with the tubing, and I honestly think you'd probably have a hard time telling where it was welded, but it's super strong now, and now it's time to do the other one. Now that the straight axle is installed and properly aligned, it's time to install the spindles in these large holes, and this is a very tricky, very exacting, and very unpleasant job. So let's get started. Here is the spindle. As you can see, there are new bronze bushings that have been installed both in this upper and lower area. The bushings have to be honed to precisely fit the kingpin. Okay, if you over-hone it, then the kingpin is loose and your spindle's sloppy and your handling suffers. If you under-hone it, then you have to drive in the kingpin with a sledgehammer, and the front end is very stiff. It'd be very hard to steer. So you have to hit exactly the perfect medium between too tight and too loose. Le Trek. Now some people use a broach to go through here, and it's a cutting rod of a sort that will go through and cut this to an exact inside diameter. I don't have a broach, so I'm going to use a standard like 3/4 inch brake hone and run it in there very carefully, several passes, then test fit the kingpin. When I can finally just lightly tap the kingpin through with a hammer, just tap, 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 and it goes through smoothly, then I will have achieved my goal. Okay, I've coated the bushings and the kingpin with a molybdenum lubricant, and I've already started tapping the kingpin through. It's going just perfectly. Then there's a thrust bearing and a shim down here. The shim takes up the travel so that the spindle can't move up and down, and the thrust bearing absorbs the weight of the car to keep this piece from eating up the bottom of this piece. Okay, let's continue tapping and see if we can finish this. Okay, it went in perfectly, and the final step is to put in what's called a cotter in here that will lock the kingpin in place so that it can't come out, okay, which would be very unpleasant at about 80 miles an hour on the interstate. So it's just like what holds the pedals on your bicycle. Okay, so I'm going to set down the camera and do that, and we'll be right back. Okay, the cotter is in place, held with a lock washer and nut. And now we check the rotational resistance, and there is some. It's pretty snug, but I really think that's going to loosen up over time, and also better that it be a little too snug. Okay, so this one's done, and now it's time to try the other one. Now that we have the spindles properly installed, it's time to install the disc brake caliper bracket and the steering arm. Next, we're going to install the lower steering arm down here. I haven't painted them yet. I'm going to go paint it, and then we're going to install it underneath so that it can communicate with the tie rod over to the other wheel, so that when this one turns to the right, the other one does exactly the same, which is always nice. Okay, so time to go start painting, and then we'll install the lower steering arms. Okay, here's the freshly painted driver's side lower steering arm ready to install. Alright, here we have that lower steering arm installed with grade 8 bolts, button head Allens on the inside, and now once I do the other side, we'll be ready to fabricate the tie rod that connects these two steering arms together. And here's the passenger side with the disc brake caliper bracket and lower steering arm installed. Now it's time to start on the disc brakes and the hubs. I've installed the proper bearing race in this side and in this side, and now I have to pack and install the large rear bearing here and a grease seal, and then we're ready to install this on the spindle. Okay, that packed inner bearing has been installed, and then the grease seal has been installed around the outside. I'll put a light layer of grease here on the lip of the seal, and then it's ready to be installed on the spindle. Well, the rotor has been slid up onto the spindle so that large inner bearing is up on its race. Now we'll need to pack the outer smaller bearing and install it with a grease seal and a castellated nut, and then the rotor should spin very smoothly and evenly on the spindle. We'll see in just a minute. Once the bearing's in place, we'll use a special washer, then a spacer, castellated nut, cotter pin, and then the outer dust cover over the hub. And there's the disc brake rotor completely installed. When you're tightening this nut, you tighten it down to where it's pretty snug, and it will start to retard the rotation. Then you back it off. I do like 1 notch. So there's absolutely no end play at all, but you're not binding the bearing or putting too much pressure on it. Okay, next cotter pin through there to keep this from unscrewing, and then the dust cover over the top. And this side is finished. Now that the spindle and rotor are completed, it's time to put the brake calipers on. This is upside down now. I just wanted you to see the 2 brake shoes and that giant piston that's going to push this one out and put pressure on the disc and stop the car, hopefully. So now it's time to install this part. Now the caliper unit has been installed on that bracket that we saw earlier. It just floats. It's sort of unusual. The thing can move back and forth along these anodized rods on either side so that it can center itself over the disc and apply pressure evenly on both sides. Okay, here's the bleeder, and under here is where the brake line is going to come in and connect. I haven't connected it yet, but it is a banjo style fitting by which it will. Now the brakes are installed on the driver's side, and as you can see, the rotor definitely lives up to its name. Just smooth as glass. Okay, so this side's finished. Now everything has to be repeated on the other side. Well, the passenger spindle, disc brake, calipers, and all are done now. So I think it's time to assemble the tie rod that connects this lower steering arm over here to that lower steering arm. And here it is. It's already very nicely painted, and the heim joints have been installed in the ends. The heim joints, one is left-handed, one is right-handed, so to adjust this, you don't have to disconnect them. You just loosen up the jam nuts and then crank the pipe one way or the other, and you'll either tighten it or loosen it. Okay, there's the tie rod installed. You notice it goes right through the center there of the two radius rods. Does that on both sides and connects, and I will have to adjust it very carefully to be sure that the toe in is correct. You want about 1/8 of an inch at toe in, very slight. Okay, now that front end is pretty well assembled and we have the tie rod back here connecting both spindles, it's time to create the steering link that's going to go between this steering arm here and this arm back here on the steering box. The way I do that is I use a piece of 7/8 inch pipe, 7/8 outside diameter, 5/8 inside diameter. Then I use an 11/16 inch fine thread tap to tap in to each end of it. Of course, the one I'm going to use a little longer. It has to be cut to exactly the right length. Then after it's threaded, we'll screw in the ball joint here that will connect to that big steering arm from the steering box. And over here we'll put in a heim joint that will connect to this steering arm here that's connected to the spindle. Okay, so as you can see, it's already been constructed, and now it's time to paint it and install it. Okay, the steering arm is finished. You can see that the ball joint now has been securely attached to this steering arm and comes forward here, and there's a button head Allen bolt holding the heim joint to the steering arm here, and it's all adjusted so that the steering wheel is absolutely horizontal, the crossbars, when the wheels are headed straight ahead. And the hairpins have been painted and bolted in also with button head Allens and secured at the rear with the ball joint. It has a tapered shaft that really locks in here to the bracket, and you can lubricate. Both of them have grease joints. So you must admit, looks pretty well finished here on this side. Now I have to do the painting and final adjustment of the hairpin radius rods on the other side, and then connect the brakes, bleed them, and I think we'll be done. Well, the paint is dried, the parts have all been assembled, and all the adjustments have been made. Let me make a slow pass all the way around both sides and the front so that you can see how it all turned out. You can see the radius rods there and that steering link at the top, the disc brakes, button head Allen bolts holding the steering arm and the radius rods. Over here, more of the same. The brake hose has been installed, and as luck would have it, if you remember when I installed the brake lines originally, they were right here, which is exactly where the tie rod was going to be rising and falling as the car goes over rough areas in the road, and was going to hit that bracket. So I had to move it back. I had to move all of the brake plumbing back so that it would be out of harm's way. Okay, nothing's ever easy, and no matter how well you plan, sometimes things just don't work out that way. So that's it. Now it's time for the tires and wheels, and then I'm going to set it down on the garage floor for the first time in over a week, and we'll see how it looks. The wheels I've chosen are the polished American 5-spoke mags, just classic mag wheels. Started out back in the 60s, and I thought that spoked look would really look nice on the front of this old car. Now I'm going to install the one on the other side. Now, never fear, eventually I'll have some outdoor shots and all from a distance where you can kind of take it all in. Right now I'm in the workshop. I can't really back up all that much because it's kind of a small, cramped workshop. But I'm trying my best to give you a good idea of how things are looking and how they turned out. Well, here's the front end resting on the tires and wheels at long last. As you can see, it went from being like 12 inches off the ground to now that front axle is down around 4 inches of clearance. Fortunately, like when you come to speed bumps, the tires will lift the axle up over the speed bump, so not a big issue unless you encounter like rocks in the middle of your lane, which hopefully won't happen. But really looking nice. It's got that nice low raked look in the front. I'm going to have to get it out in the sun tomorrow and we'll get some shots from a distance. But for now, I think it's looking pretty sweet. Hope you agree. As a final touch, I wanted to come up with a way to mount shock absorber to this front end now that it's extended out way past the front of the frame. That's called a suicide front end. I want to use this kind of a neat shock absorber mount that's present here and also combine it with a headlight mount. Now the way they did it was to bolt this onto the front for the headlight and then install the shock back here to the original front end. But I came up with a way that I thought would suit the modified suspension and actually look real nice. See what you think. Here it is. I cut off the top right here, cut this off, these ears, because they're not useful, mounted the shock to the front with a heavy reinforcement here, and then installed a little an inverted cup over on the right hand side of the top of that abbreviated mount for the headlight. I also tilted the headlight a little bit away from the radiator and it's now set back about 2.5 or 3 inches to further accentuate, as you can see, the extension of the front end. All in all, I thought it was as neat as it could be. The holes in that headlight shock mount sort of mimic the holes in the straight axle, and I think that the contrast of some chrome and polished stainless parts with the black painted parts came out pretty nice. I hope you like it. Let's take one look from behind. You'll see why I think the tilt out of the headlight really suited it. Okay, it just sort of balances everything here. It's really like a metal sculpture and it has to be pleasing to the eye. Okay, so that is how I'm going to do the shock mount and headlight mount. I need to do this one over here and then the project will be finished. And for the lower mount, I simply welded 2 grade 8 bolts head to head. One of them goes through the bottom of the shock with a rubber bushing, and the other goes through the radius rod and holds it to the bat wing. Okay, so now the shock is directly connected to the lower bat wing and thus to the straight axle. And the end result is very neat and simple, the way I like it.